holidays or when you leave home for a while, I wonder what things you miss about home. Maybe you miss your favourite seat where you always sat and watched TV, or you miss being able to put on your slippers at night after the day is done, or you miss just the daily routine of everything and the familiarity of your home. But I wonder if we go away for a while, I wonder how many of us say, I really miss church. I really miss meeting with all those other people that we meet with each week to worship the Lord together. Well, I hope if we are away for a while that we do miss church, we do miss meeting together with each other and worshipping the Lord together. But when David was away from home for a while, he tells us what he missed the most about being away from home. And it was worshipping the Lord. As we have seen with all of these Psalms that we've been looking at over this past number of weeks, really since the end of June, I think, they've all been had an historical setting. David tells us why he is writing them and the situation that he was facing in life. And in this one, in Psalm 63, we find that he was in the wilderness of Judah. As we see later on in the Psalm, he must have been king. So it's very likely that this psalm took place during the events, or it was written because of the events of 2 Samuel 15 to 18, when David was on the run from his son Absalom. His son Absalom had rebelled against David, and David was forced to go into hiding in the wilderness in Judah for a while Absalom was trying to take the throne from his father. And the one thing he missed the most in this psalm wasn't his parents, wasn't his home, wasn't the familiarity of living in Jerusalem and living in wherever it was that he lived. The one thing that he missed most of all was being able to worship the Lord in the sanctuary in Jerusalem, where God ordered his people and commanded his people to worship him. It was there in the sanctuary, the big movable tent called the tabernacle that Moses had built or had built while he was in the wilderness, which still must have existed at that stage. David missed worshipping the Lord there. It was the place where sacrifices were offered to God, the only place where sacrifices were properly allowed to be offered. It was the place where the priests offered those sacrifices. It was a place that had the Holy of Holies, that had the Ark of the Covenant, the place that the cloud rested above it, representing God's presence amongst his people. But it wasn't those sacrifices that were offered that he missed. It wasn't because he loved the colour and spectacle of the events that he missed the tabernacle, but he missed it because he missed being able to worship the Lord and to remind himself of all that the Lord had promised to do for him. That's what he said whenever he wrote in verse 1, "O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water." David knew the privilege of being able to say that God was his God, and so he longed to worship the Lord at the tabernacle. Yes, it's true that God is everywhere, and now we can worship God anywhere because God is with his people. We have his Spirit dwelling in us. But David knows that he's missing out on being able to worship the Lord at the tabernacle and drawing close to the Lord in worship. In many ways, the wilderness, the dry and weary land that he was living in, is the perfect illustration of just David struggling with the fact that he couldn't worship with the Lord. When you think of a wilderness, I wonder what images come into your mind. Maybe you conjure up an image of a barren landscape that never seems to end. There's no vegetation, no trees, there's nothing growing. Perhaps you think of a dust cloud blowing and all the dust blowing in the air, and a tumbleweed. I don't know if they have tumbleweeds, but you know what I mean. Tumbleweeds, you certainly see them in Westerners, but just imagine something like that in the desert in Judah. And there was little water to give life. That's exactly how David felt as he was away from the Lord, and that he wasn't able to worship the Lord and see God in his glory at the tabernacle. There was nothing, if you like, in the wilderness to help him spiritually. He was longing to be able to worship the Lord by offering sacrifices and seeing the Lord dwell with his people in the cloud that rested above the tabernacle. Can you understand what David is expressing in this psalm? He's telling us about his spiritual hunger for the Lord. So when you think of your own life, have you that hunger for the Lord? If you profess faith in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Saviour, you're glad, I'm sure, because you have eternal life. But have you that desire to know the Lord in a deeper way and to walk closely with him? If we think about our lives, there are lots of things that we can fill our minds with, as Dave was reminding us of earlier on, and they grab our attention and can so easily become more important to us than, and as a result, they push out that desire to know the Lord. And yet when we realise we are doing that, then we realise how much we miss out on knowing the Lord in an even deeper way. As we look at this psalm, we see David's great desire. It was greater than his desire for safety, greater than his desire for a peaceful life, greater than his desire for material prosperity. It was his desire to worship the Lord, to know him, that he described as being like thirsty and hungry. So as we think about Psalm 63, it's both an encouragement and a challenge. It's an encouragement to remind us just of how great it is to know the Lord, and of how much we know of him. There's still so much more to discover. There's so much more to understand of his love and of his mercy and of his grace. But it's also a challenge to us. Are we seeking to know the Lord in a deeper way? Because if we do, we are becoming like David and growing in our knowledge and understanding and love for the Lord. So the first thing we see is what gave David this hunger for the Lord in verses 2 and 3. When David thought about going to worship the Lord in the tabernacle, there were, maybe 2 or 3 things that struck him about the Lord that made him want to worship the Lord. There was, first of all, we read there in verse 2 that he looked on the sanctuary and he beheld God's power and glory. As he looked on the tabernacle, where God dwelled, he saw all the things that went on in the tabernacle that pointed to the Lord's power and glory. Things like the sacrifices that were being offered, and what they meant, or like the furnishings in the tabernacle that all had significance and were spiritually could teach believers a lesson of what it meant, of who God was. He could see how the high priest in his robes and all the different things that the high priest's robes pointed to, and how again it taught him about the Lord and revealed so much to the Lord of who the Lord is to David. There was the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy of Holies, and again just how David was able to see so much about the Lord through that. And then there was the cloud that hovered above the tent where the Holy of Holies was, symbolising that God dwelled with his people. When David saw all of these things, he knew that they represented and revealed God's greatness and power, and that you could only come into God's presence through the blood of the sacrifice that God had provided. That's what David tells us made God's power and glory so evident to him as he looked at the temple, at the tabernacle. But not just his power and his glory, for there in verse 3 we read that your steadfast love as well, that's what attracted David to worshipping the Lord, his steadfast love. How the Lord never leaves his people, he never deserts his people. No matter what situation they face, no matter how difficult the time, the Lord will protect his people and bless them, because he is a loving and a gracious God. David knew God's steadfast love, and as you read David's life, you'll see that he was just going from one scrape to another, one episode to another, one situation where his life was in danger to another situation. And yet the Lord had protected him many times. And David knew that the Lord would continue to protect him, no matter how difficult the situation David was in. God would be faithful to David because of his steadfast love, that he would fulfill his purpose for David's life. And so David was amazed by God's steadfast love, which he said was better than life. Now, when you think of those three things, God's power, and God's glory, and God's steadfast love, that made David seek the Lord, they weren't just qualities about the Lord that David saw. Instead, to whatever extent David saw them, we can see them more clearly today. Because these qualities, his power, his glory, and his steadfast love, they are the foundations of the gospel. They are, because while David might have seen them as he worshipped the Lord at the sanctuary, at the tabernacle, now they have spread, knowledge of God has spread all over the world. Because God has shown us in a far greater way than any movable tent in the wilderness his power and his glory and his steadfast love. So think of God's power. Don't we see his power which is displayed on the cross? How he took Jesus' death, which looked to so many people like a defeat, but he used it as a way of dealing with sin. So that his power is seen in what looked weak, and he turned it into victory. Or think of his glory. Don't we see God's glory in Jesus? Because he is the Word who has become flesh. And as John 1 says, we have seen his glory, the glory of the only begotten Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. Those who saw him marvelled at him. They marvelled at the miracles that he did, the gracious way that he acted, the things that he taught people. How many people realised how great Jesus is? Think of those things, of how he revealed his glory, even on the Mount of Olives, at the Mount of Transfiguration, to Peter, to James and to John. And then think of his steadfast love. He will never reject his people, because he is a God who is filled with steadfast love towards his people. If he didn't have that steadfast love, if it was possible for a believer to lose their faith, then it would mean that someone that he died for on the cross, and whose salvation that he had bought and paid for with his own blood, could be lost. And he would not be faithful to that person whom he had paid such a tremendous price for. His steadfast love means that the person who trusts in him will never be lost. Yes, a believer might wander away and might end up in sin, but the Lord will draw his people back to him because of his steadfast love that he has for his people. So in the gospel we see these three qualities about the Lord. We see his love, we see his power, and we see his glory. And it was these three truths that made David want to worship the Lord. And if David could see them at the tabernacle displayed, how much more then can we not see them also in Jesus? In the whole of the Bible, we have such an advantage to David, and we should be able to see it even more clearly expressed to us in who Jesus is. For David, it was these things about the Lord that made him want to worship the Lord, and that drew him to the Lord. But what is it for us that draws us to worship the Lord? Maybe it's the friendliness of other people. Maybe it's the love that you experience as you meet here from other people in this church. Maybe it could be for lots of different reasons. But surely the one reason that we should be here is because of Jesus. Because of his power and of his glory and of his steadfast love. Because we know that as we meet together, there's a sense in which God dwells with his people whenever we meet together, that we experience all of these things in a greater way. And so we should want to seek after him. And this is the place that we come to do it, that we see God's power and glory in a greater way. But sadly for lots of people, when they hear who the Lord is, they can read the Bible for themselves. They can go to the church, but it doesn't mean anything to them. And the reason is they don't believe or what they hear, or because they don't combine it with faith. We read in 2 Corinthians 4 verse 4, in their case the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. So if you can't see the power and glory and steadfast love of the Lord, It's because your mind has been blinded by the devil, by the evil one. So you don't get it. And you don't combine what you hear with faith. So you don't get what's so great about Jesus. If you think that's you, then realize that you're missing out on the greatest thing ever, on knowing the Lord. Because that's the greatest thing we can ever know, is to know who Jesus is in his power and in his glory. So that's the first thing. That's what the source, if you like, that's what David made David want to seek after God, because of his power and glory and steadfast love. And secondly, in verses 4 to 8, we see the result of this. Why did David do this? Well, it's always true that what we believe will shape what we do with our lives. Because what we think shapes our actions. And that's true when it comes to what David thought of the Lord. Because what David knew of the Lord made David act in the way that he did. He knew of God's glory and his power and his steadfast love. And so he wanted to seek after God, to know him more. And how he does this is seen in these verses. Because there are three things that David tells us in these verses came as a result of seeking after God. The first is that he would be satisfied with his knowledge of the Lord. Remember in verse 1 how David was thirsty and hungry for the Lord. Now that he remembers the qualities of God that he saw about the Lord at the tabernacle, he knows that he has found in the Lord what will give him joy and peace that nothing else this world can ever give to him. It might seem a strange thing for lots of people, but did you know that when we realize who the Lord is, what Jesus has done for us on the cross, the spiritual riches that belong to every believer because we are in Christ. Do you realize that because we have been called and chosen and justified and adopted and are being sanctified, and someday will be glorified with a new resurrection body, and that what the Lord has prepared for us is so great that no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who trust in him. Believers are the most blessed of people in the whole of the history of the world. In fact, in the whole history of the world, there is not and never will be a group of people who have been as blessed in any way as believers are. So when we think of how God has loved us, even though we haven't deserved it, when we think of how we can say that God is our God and that he loves us, there's nothing else that can give us meaning in life, nothing else that can give us a joy and a peace when we realize just what exactly it is that God has done for us in Christ. So if you got to that point in your walk with the Lord, that like David, you can say that worshipping him with your soul, that you will be satisfied as with fat and with rich food. So that when you think about the Lord, that you realize that there's nothing better than knowing the Lord. So David knew that he would be satisfied when he thought about the Lord. He also knew that he would want to meditate on who God is. There in verse 6 he says, I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. Now, to meditate on the Lord simply means to think about who he is, to think about what he has done for us, to think about it again and again, so that we will, because the more we think about it, the more we will come to understand the depth of what Jesus did for us on the cross. It could be thinking of listening again to what you hear this morning. It could be reading the Bible for yourself, taking a verse from the Bible and thinking about it again and again, and you'll discover all sorts of new truths. The Lord will bless it in many ways to you, and it will be such an encouragement to you. It could be praying through a passage of Scripture. But what we have to do is to meditate on God, on who God is. Meditate on his word. So when we meditate on a word, we are in many ways like a cow chewing her cud. When a cow will takes a mouthful of grass, she chews it, and then she swallows it, and it goes into one of her stomachs, and it's broken down, and then she brings it up again and chews it again, and then this can happen maybe up to 3 or 4 times until the cow has completely broken down all the grass, and her stomachs have completely digested it and got all the nutrients from it that the grass contains. And when we meditate on God's word, we do something similar, because we think about what God says, we analyse it, we maybe think about how it connects with another passage, and we think about how it points to Jesus, and so that is an encouragement to us. And the more we, if you like a cow chewing their cud, the more we think about it, the more wonderful truths there are in God's word that should encourage us and help us in our faith, in our walk with the Lord. So do you meditate on the Lord and think about what the Bible says? Or when you hear a sermon, do you go away and think about it to get more from it? Because that's what we need to do if we want to seek after the Lord. We need to be thinking about Him and who He is and all the time. And that comes from gaining a deeper insight into what He's done for us that we read about in His Word. And the third thing that David hungers for, the Lord made him do, that David's hunger for the Lord made him do, was to realise that he could rest in the Lord in verses 7 and 8. David knew of God's glory and power and steadfast love, and because it satisfied him and he meditated on it, David knew then that he could rest in the Lord. For him, there he says, you have been, verse 7, you have been my help. You, in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. My soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me. David realised, because he knew God, these qualities about God, because he knew God's power, and because he meditated on God and who God was, and thought about the Lord all the time, David realised that the Lord could help him. That no matter what situation that David was in, David knew that the Lord would be like his rock, his shelter. The Lord would be like those, his right hand would uphold him. The Lord would be a shadow protecting him and looking over him all the time. David knew these words, these truths, because he had, if you like, done the groundwork beforehand. He'd been meditating on God's word, and he knew that he could trust the Lord. And sometimes, I remember many years ago, someone there's been a bit of trouble, and someone would give me all these Bible verses. To be honest with you, it didn't really do me a lot of good. It made me feel worse. And the problem was not with their intentions, which were good, not with God's word, which is inspired. It was with me, because in many ways I hadn't done the groundwork, and I hadn't meditated in God's word, and I hadn't realised that He would hold me with His right hand, that He'd overshadow me. And so whenever the time of testing came, then I crumpled. But when we meditate in God's word and who He is, we'll find ourselves able to rest in His power, able to trust in Him, knowing that He would help us and strengthen us, because He's a gracious and a loving God. So are we able to rest in the Lord like David was? So do you see what knowing the Lord did for David? It made him realise how blessed he was to find in life the truth that will satisfy him. It made him think about the Lord to understand more of who He is and what He's done for us, and made it rest in God's power in his life. So are you trusting more in the Lord? And then thirdly, we see David's hunger for God gave him strength to face his enemies. In these verses, it's almost like David came back to earth with a bump. For thinking about God's power and His glory and His steadfast love, and being caught up, if you like, in all these wonderful things about who the Lord is, and knowing he could rest in Him, David came back to earth when he started to think about the situation that he was facing. How his son Absalom was rebelling against him, how his throne and his power were on a knife edge. But these things that he knew about the Lord were what strengthened him and helped him. It gave him the confidence that he needed to face the challenges in his life. And we read there in verse 9, because he sought after the Lord, he was sure that there would be a judgment to come. He was sure that the Lord would fulfill his purpose for David. And those who opposed David were actually opposing the Lord. And there will be a judgment to come for those who oppose David. And David knew this, because David knew God and what God had planned for him. And he said it's much more than just his enemies, their plans falling around them, but much more seriously than that. They shall go down into the depths of the earth. David knew that there was an eternal judgment to come, that they would face separation from the Lord if they didn't trust in Jesus and put their faith in God and return from their sins to trust in the Lord and ask for the Lord's help and mercy and grace. And so that helped David when he faced his enemies, because David knew he wasn't powerless. Well, David knew he was powerless in some ways, but he knew the Lord wasn't. And the Lord would uphold him and be a shadow over him. And so David knew he could trust the Lord. But then as verse 11 says, David knew he could rejoice in God, because he says in verse 11, the king shall rejoice in God. All who swear by him shall exult, for the mouth of liars will be stopped. Those who reject the Lord will suffer the judgment to come. And there will be those who know the Lord and seek him, who know that while they face struggles, yes, they will be victorious. And such confidence comes from knowing the Lord, knowing what he says, knowing his ways and trusting in him, and shaping our lives according to who God is. That's what it means for us to seek the Lord. We know that he's able, we know that he's sufficient in every situation, and that even whenever we feel overwhelmed, we know the Lord will uphold us with his right hand in his strength and grace. And all this comes from seeking the Lord. You know, it's not pie in the sky stuff. It's not kind of, well, that's okay, but I want to know how to really live for the Lord. Living for the Lord comes from knowing who he is, knowing his qualities and his characteristics, knowing what he's like, knowing that we can trust in him in every situation. It comes from thinking about these things and growing in our faith. So are you seeking the Lord? Because the riches of who he is are more satisfying than anything this world can ever give to us. And they are what will help us to love him in every situation in life. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. Is that written about you? Well then, the answer is found in the rest of this psalm. When we know who God is, we meditate on his word, we let that shape our lives to help us to live for the Lord. Let's pray.